Some people call Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy one of the best collective pieces of Batman media ever created. It certainly popularized the character in a way that had not been done since the original Tim Burton film. However, I don't personally agree with those people. Like, yeah, are they great crime thrillers? Yeah, absolutely. But as time goes on, I genuinely feel that the success of these films hampered the Batman. It did more harm to the public perception of Batman than good. The Nolan trilogy has cast a shadow over all other things Batman, influencing how we create Batman media, from the games, the comics, to television, to animation. DC, across its multiple iterations, tried to align their world with the version audiences saw in Nolan's trilogy.
It's a black tank.
Doesn't get those wonderful toys.
Some modern Batman stories, like the Wayne Family Ventures or Lego Batman, exists in conversation with the greater whole of Batman media, to the start to the present. Other works, like the Arkham games, took the best components of everything to make something fantastic. But they are lesser works that have come out since the Nolan trilogy that tried to recapture the magic for a broader audience, and I think hampered what Batman is. I'm especially, of course, referring to the live-action iterations. More specifically, the DC expanded universe version of Batman as played by Ben Affleck, as well as the Joker. The best iterations of Batman have been able to really balance everything. Even the Injustice games, much as I enjoy them, they are shades of Nolan's less satisfying elements that shine through. But what do I mean by all this? Well, there's a lot to cover, and I think you have to break it down by all the components that make Batman Batman, and in turn, how public perception of these components was altered completely by Nolan. Before going entirely into what I don't like about the Nolan films and how they've influenced the Batman character, I do want to point out what I do like. Nolan's trilogy has a great arc for its title character. For Bruce Wayne's arc from becoming just this rich playboy to becoming the Batman, to self-sacrifice, to overcoming all obstacles. There's a lot to like here. I especially love Jim Gordon's arc in these films. I love how Two-Face is able to have this tragic fall. And yes, Heath Ledger's Joker remains one of the greatest comic book villains of all time. While I think these individual components work very well in the films that they belong to, my focus is not on how they work in the trilogy itself necessarily, but how this either cheapens the characters from the comics, or B, impacts later media that maybe shouldn't have followed Nolan's example so closely. Let's start with the most obvious example, the city of Gotham itself. Gotham as a city went through multiple transformations. The cities of the DC universe are heightened realities. They're not really supposed to be like New York City or Chicago. They're kind of exaggerated versions of both what a city can be, as well as extensions of the mood projected by both the superhero that occupies that city and the villains that lurk within it. Metropolis, for example, looks like Tomorrowland. It doesn't look like any real city. It looks like a heightened future as it was perceived in the 40s. And as time goes on, it becomes this Art Deco kind of grandiose idea of a glorious city upon a hill. Whereas Gotham combined two particular elements I think really informed how people watch and interpret Gotham. The first is the noir genre. It's meant to be this dark, shady place where crime is afoot, where mysteries are asunder, where you can imagine someone smoking a cigarette while drinking a hot coffee and talking about lost loves and all that. The other component, which blends perfectly with the noir, is the gothic. The vampire story, the old classic stories from Edgar Allan Poe. That shadowy, dark romanticism that really enhances and feels unreal but also dreamlike in nature. So those two components are very visible throughout older iterations of Gotham. Tim Burton's Gotham is undeniably influenced by his gothic sensibilities. It would feel right at home in any Burton-esque world, especially in Batman Returns. However, it also combines the timeless elements of the noir genre. The characters dress out of place for their time. We have modern music by Prince and modern cars, but everyone wears those wide-brimmed hats and jackets you'd expect in a 1940s gangster film. As such, the combination of elements from the 40s and 1840s creates a world that feels out of step with the rest of time, in a way that enhances the atmosphere of every scene. It is at once oppressive, but also incredibly familiar. Whereas the DC animated universe version of Gotham emphasizes that noir style. In fact, the animated stills were done on black paper to heighten the shadows and darkness. But when Nolan took over Gotham, he changed it so it became more aligned with a real city, and in doing so, removed some of the noir and gothic elements bit by bit until there was nothing left. I want to give Nolan credit though. In Batman Begins, Gotham as a city has a style, and we see that style shift as the time passes in Gotham. When it first starts off, we see Gotham in the past. We see it coming out of this Great Depression that we find out later was possibly very much triggered by the League of Shadows. Gotham is crumbling, yet the Wayne family, especially Thomas Wayne, has helped rebuild it.
Did you build this train then?
Gotham's been good to our family, but the city's been suffering. People less fortunate than us have been enduring very hard times.
It's a newly constructed city with a railroad that leads throughout all of Gotham to connect every component of the city together. And in this way, we see a city in recovery and construction. When Batman comes to Gotham after his training, however, Gotham is now run down, it's rusted, it's eroded. The dream city has crumbled, but we see the fragments of what Thomas Wayne tried to construct under the surface. We also see the divide between the rich and the poor. While the poor live in these downtrodden areas where there's musk and shadow, and Joffrey from Game of Thrones is apparently the nicest person in town, we get to the rich side, it's all white, it's all sterile, and that contrast really instills the divide between the rich and the poor in that first film. Gotham becomes a character in Batman Begins that the later films in the trilogy don't even try to capture. And then there's Wayne Manor. It's separated from it all. It looks like a Gothic cathedral, and much like the House of Usher in Edgar Allan Poe's story, it too crumbles at the end, as the very foundations upon which Gotham and Batman are built are shaken by the League of Shadows. Notably, Batman Begins ends with Bruce Wayne and Alfred commenting how Wayne Manor will need to be rebuilt.
Rebuild it? Just the way it was, brick for brick.
Just the way it was, sir. I thought this might be a good opportunity for improving the foundations.
In such a sense, Gotham itself needs to be rebuilt after the disaster of the League of Shadows. But what city Gotham would be rebuilt into impacts the themes and ideas that follow in the subsequent two films. When it comes to The Dark Knight, Wayne Manor has been burned down, so Batman's living in a penthouse. A sterile city, much like the wealthy parts that we saw in Batman Begins. Batman's Batcave is no longer a Gothic cave under his mansion, it's in some warehouse in the middle of a docking bay. Very sterile, all whites and blacks, not much personality. Gotham itself as a city becomes standardized, and that removes all the personality we saw in both the contrast between the wealthy upscale parts and the poor parts, as well as the crumbling ruin of what was. There's no future metropolis, it's just now a city. Gotham isn't special, it's just like New York or Chicago. Come The Dark Knight Rises, it's even more glaring, because we get this sense that the poor are downtrodden and they're struggling, while the rich are reaping the benefits of society. But we never see that conflict communicated through the set design, like we did in Batman Begins. Batman Begins did a great job setting apart the rich from the poor and that division therein. But in The Dark Knight Rises, everywhere looks like the rich places did in Batman Begins. So we don't get a visual of how the poor feels. Even when Gotham is ruined, quote unquote, by Bane at the end, it's not so much that the city is crumbling, it's that the buildings are just empty and there's more clutter inside certain buildings. But we see from the outside, everything looks pretty okay. It doesn't look too different, not the same way that Batman Begins had that visual difference. This strips Gotham away of its spirit in many ways, and future versions of Gotham tried to capture the Nolan Gotham, the generic city. Watch Batman v Superman. Gotham in that movie looks so similar to Metropolis, there's some parts where you might confuse shots in Metropolis of shots for Gotham. And if you confuse Metropolis for Gotham, you're doing something really wrong with your set design. I'm telling you that right now. Even Matt Reeves' version of the Batman with Gotham, while it has this dreamlike quality and the shadows are more emphasized and the noir angle is more developed, it still does look like a regular city. Though I will say there's some shots where Gotham really does get that personality, especially due to the emphasis of darkness in various scenes. The Batman gets Gotham a little better. Now, if Gotham were the only problem, that would be one thing. But a huge thing that Nolan changed for the worst is Batman's rogues gallery. See, Batman has some of the most iconic villains to ever exist, but Nolan, by taking away all the color and surreality of his villains, he wanted to make Batman's villains feel like they existed in the real world, like something out of a Scorsese or a Michael Mann film. Heat was a big inspiration for The Dark Knight, after all. But in trying to make these guys feel like ordinary crooks, what ends up happening is two things. Nolan shaves away the more unreal and supernatural antagonists Batman faces, and he also de-elevates the heightened reality of Batman's rogues. I want to bring up the Long Halloween because I feel that's a very important entry in both Batman comics and the influences behind various Batman films. The Long Halloween's core conflict is ultimately the turning of the tide, how the old guard of gangsters and criminals are replaced in Gotham by these colorful, more uncontrollable threats like the Joker, Riddler, Penguin, etc. We see that to an extent in The Batman. Over the course of the film, we're shown how Carmine Falcone runs the city of Gotham. However, the whole film focuses on the Riddler, slowly chipping away at Falcone's authority over Gotham. Come his assassination, Gotham transitions entirely into a world dominated by the costumed and colorful antagonists who have been teased around the periphery of the story thus far. The Penguin, for example, shows that transition perfectly, with the old guard of criminals being dismissed and destroyed by a new generation of more unstable characters. The heightened reality replaces the former reality. Gotham becomes a haven for maniacs and those who would go into Arkham Asylum. Now, The Dark Knight does also adapt The Long Halloween, and on paper, it looks like a great adaptation.
You squeezed them, you hammered them to the point of desperation. And in that desperation, they turned to a man they didn't fully understand.
You have the Joker coming in to upend the hierarchy of the criminal underworld. Batman, Jim Gordon, and Two-Face work together to stop the criminals and Joker, and at the end of the day, there's a transition from the old guard of Gotham to a new costumed mania taking hold of Gotham City. The reason this fails, however, is because we find out after The Dark Knight that crime was basically stopped. The Long Halloween is the transition from the organized crime of the past to a more uncontrollable crime of the present. But we just transitioned from crime to a brief episode of mania to 8 years of peace. And then that's broken up by Bane, who is extremely organized and forms a terrorist coalition as opposed to a costumed band of lunatics. It doesn't work as an adaptation of The Long Halloween, not because it doesn't follow the ideas of the story, but because it does not function as a transition from one era to the other. The Long Halloween harkens danger. This harkens an era of peace, and that's not the same thing. By stripping away this element, it removes a key component of what makes Batman's villains so interesting. Nolan only chose a certain set of villains, the ones who wouldn't end up in Arkham Asylum. Blackgate Prison poses a much bigger role in Batman's lore because Batman is taking down criminals. He's taking down organized crime. He's not taking down the lone costumed villains that he would often face in the comics. In the Nolan films, the villains are as follows: Ra's al Ghul, Carmine Falcone, Scarecrow, Joker, Two-Face, Bane, Catwoman, and Talia al Ghul, with Victor Zsasz showing up briefly in a couple scenes in Batman Begins.
In my opinion, Mr. Zsasz is as much a danger to himself as to others.
Falcone, he is ultimately in the criminal underworld this mythic, gigantic figure who experiences a great fall as the Batman shows up, breaks down his operations, and his own crimes come back to haunt him. In The Batman, we see that Falcone has this intense control over all of Gotham. He controls the police, the justice system. In Penguin, we find out that he's even covered up his own murders by pinning it on his own daughter, controlling Arkham Asylum as a sort of way to silence his enemies without ever actually having to lay a finger on them, pushing blame away from himself as well as pushing blame on an innocent person. But in Batman Begins, Carmine Falcone is just a crime boss. We are told he controls the city. We are told he has influence. But what do we actually see? We see Carmine Falcone play as an unwitting pawn to both Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul. We see Carmine Falcone pull a gun on Bruce and say, "I can shoot you right now and no one's going to stop me because I have fear over them. Yeah, whatever." Which is just bluster. Now, the performance is good, but the writing does not back up why we should fear this guy all that much. Because from the audience's perspective, especially in the hierarchy of Batman villains, Falcone is just a gangster. And in fact, all the criminals in the Dark Knight movies, from Salvatore Maroni to all the henchmen, they're just generic criminals. Yes, they have character arcs that are interesting, sure, but if you watch the movie, you don't get a sense that these are guys you should fear. Not compared to Scarecrow, not compared to Ra's al Ghul, not compared to the Joker or Two-Face. They feel very much like small obstacles Batman has to face to get to the real threat. Whereas in The Batman, Carmine Falcone is a real threat. In an effort to make Falcone less of a stereotype as he is in the comics, I mean, after all, he's basically just a character who walked off the Godfather set. What Nolan does is he removes all the threat level that the Falcone from the comics posed, leaving just a guy. Falcone in Batman Begins could have been anyone. He didn't have to be Carmine Falcone from the comics. He could have been Maxie Zeus, he could have been the Black Mask, he could have been anyone. But they chose Falcone, and the end result is just a guy named Falcone. Hell, like a lot of the villains in the Batman movies that Nolan made, he's not even called Falcone, he's Falcone, which is, I don't know. I mean, between that and Ra's al Ghul, I just feel like Nolan didn't, whatever, who knows. I can't make fun of anyone for mispronouncing names, I do it all the time. Anyway, yeah, Falcone is realistic, but in the effort to make him more realistic, Nolan removes all the elements that made the comic book Falcone interesting. And Carmine Falcone is the most realistic of these villains. When we get to the other villains, it gets a little worse. Scarecrow, I think, is one of Batman's greatest villains. He's a great case where you can externalize the internal conflicts the characters face with his fear toxin. If you ever played Batman Arkham Asylum, you've seen some of the most incredible levels designed around the Scarecrow. The creeping surreality of it all. Starting small before escalating into these larger-than-life sequences. Even the MCU with Mysterio has one of the most visually stunning sequences of any villain conflict with Mysterio casting these illusions. Scarecrow, I feel in Nolan's trilogy, is wasted. We do see these brief snippets of hallucinations, but they're very much slight hallucinations. We see the characters afraid, but we don't really see ultimately what they're afraid of, and usually it's just the idea of fear, as opposed to fear emphasizing certain character arcs in the story. The closest we get to fear being explored by Scarecrow is seeing Batman seeing bats coming out of Scarecrow's face and imagining his parents passing. But that's not really an exploration of what makes Batman afraid, it's just kind of a hodgepodge. And later hallucinations feel very generic and bland as opposed to highly particular to their set of fears. And after Scarecrow's initial conflict with Batman, where he beats Batman pretty handedly, Batman does not have another conflict with Scarecrow directly until he turns Scarecrow's fear toxin against him. And after that, Scarecrow is delegated to a minor threat. Rachel tasers him. He beats him in The Dark Knight pretty quickly. He shows up in The Dark Knight Rises and doesn't even get a final conflict with Batman. It's very disappointing to see one of the greatest villains Batman's ever faced delegated to a lesser threat, or the Team Rocket of the Dark Knight trilogy, essentially. Again, Cillian Murphy is fantastic as Scarecrow, but the writing and the way his fear toxin is presented on screen do him no favors in the story. And what's really frustrating is that Scarecrow is the only tie that any of these characters have to Arkham Asylum, which is a major component of the Batman lore. It's a great place for villains to lurk, and yet we never see anything happen there. We just see him send Falcone, and then that's it. That's the last we hear of Arkham. It's all Blackgate Prison after that. Bane especially is frustrating, because Bane is said to be this great threat, but he's ultimately relegated to just being a henchman for Talia al Ghul. In fact, the Al Ghul family in general becomes the de facto main villains of the Dark Knight trilogy. And Talia al Ghul is completely wasted. She's one of the worst depictions of the character in history. It's objectively not a very compelling villain. She's not very interesting on screen. She doesn't have any good scenes, and her death sequence is the most pathetic thing I've ever seen in my life. It's just a very underwhelming, limp fart of a character. And the fact that it also deflates Bane's presence in the story makes it worse. Oh, and hot take, the fight scenes in The Dark Knight are all terrible, but the most disappointing one of all is Bane versus Batman. For a scene supposed to break the bat, I barely even noticed. It feels like Bane just drops Batman on his knee. We don't get a sense of that satisfying crack we see in the comics. It's more just up, he got a little kneed in the back, it's fine. He can walk it off probably. There's never that sense of, oh, this is like a final defeat for Batman. Two-Face's arc in The Dark Knight is absolutely fantastic. but it sets a negative precedent that a lot of films and stories followed. Two-Face is more than just his origin story. Two-Face continues to be a villain. Batman continues to try to get Harvey help that he needs.
Bruce. Good old Bruce. Always there. You never give up on me.
Because Two-Face is killed off so quickly after appearing, it set this negative precedent that Two-Face is only interesting as Harvey Dent becoming Two-Face. And that's reflected in Gotham Knights, Joker 2, Batman the Caped Crusader. We don't get a sense of Two-Face as the active criminal threat of Two-Face, him trying to exist further, him in relation with his other criminals who he's put away over time. There's more interaction between Two-Face and Poison Ivy in the DC animated universe than there is between Two-Face and the Joker. That's like a minor interaction in the animated series that was interesting and informs further interactions between these two characters. When you consider how relevant Joker is to Harvey Dent's storyline in The Dark Knight, it's shocking they only have a couple interactions. And even then, when they do interact, it's amazing how little of Harvey Dent's actual grudge against the Joker plays into his actions. He flips a coin and then just never blames Joker for what happens again.
He made you like this.
The Joker's just a mad dog. I want whoever let him off the leash.
He blames everyone else, sure, but it's strange how little the relationship between Joker and Two-Face really matters when you think about it. Despite Joker destroying Harvey's life, Joker and Harvey have no connection by the end of the story, beyond Joker using Harvey as a tool. This diminishes the value of Harvey's pain in a way that I think undermines the creative potential of these characters. Not to say the storyline doesn't work, it does in the context of the story, but it robs Two-Face of a lot of potential as a storytelling mechanic and feels more like an avenue to further Batman and Jim Gordon's story than necessarily Harvey's story. And don't get me started with Catwoman. Catwoman in the Nolan films is entirely functional. She only exists in terms of what purpose she serves in the plot. She doesn't feel spontaneous, she doesn't feel flirtatious, she doesn't feel flexible. She feels very much like a character who serves a point in the bigger story and nothing beyond that. Catwoman should always be like an extra third wheel, something that interrupts the narrative and disrupts what's going on, as opposed to conforming within it. Consider Michelle Pfeiffer in Batman Returns. The movie's really about Max Schreck, the businessman, and Penguin. Catwoman comes in and just throws a monkey wrench in the whole deal. She disrupts the plot for her own ends, and doing so makes the movie far more interesting. In The Batman, Catwoman is also a monkey wrench. She comes in, is completely independent of the main conflict with the Riddler, but as a result helps further the narrative through her interactions with Batman. But she feels disconnected because she's not really directly related to the Riddler. But in doing that, it actually enhances the narrative, adding conflict and deepening certain characters in a way that wouldn't have been happening otherwise. However, in The Dark Knight Rises, Catwoman exists primarily as a tool of Bane and Talia al Ghul until she turns on them. She's incredibly functional in both Bane and Batman's plots, and it doesn't feel like she really adds anything with her pursuit of that whole algorithm that will clear her record or whatever. We don't see her really robbing jewels or having fun or enjoying herself. She just exists for certain scenes to do a certain purpose, and everything is very functional within the confines of the narrative. Catwoman should feel superfluous, but also impactful. Ra's al Ghul's fine though. I think he's alright. I think they should have gotten a different actor to play him. Liam Neeson's great in the role, but would have been better to have a Middle Eastern actor, I think, but I digress. But here's the other thing too that's really frustrating. Because Nolan only focuses on criminals, and the more sane criminals at that, we lose a lot of his more iconic rogues. We don't see the instability of Penguin. We don't see the Riddler's obsessive-compulsive drive. We don't see the Mad Hatter. We don't see any of those guys. But we also don't see characters like Mr. Freeze, or Clayface, or Poison Ivy, who are more fantastical in nature, because we want to be realistic, quote-unquote. But I think of all these characters, the one that suffers the most, and the one who benefits the most, ironically, from this style, is Joker. Heath Ledger's Joker is undeniably one of the greatest villain performances in cinema history. His Joker is perfect. This is not a critique of the Joker character itself. It is a critique of how people have tried to follow up the Joker character. Before Heath Ledger, the Joker was the clown prince of crime. He was an objectively funny character who also had a very sick, dark sense of humor. That humor did translate into other media. Jack Nicholson and Mark Hamill both bring this kind of playful zaniness to the character. When it comes down to it, they are going to inflict massive harm upon you and destroy your life. They are not friendly clowns, they are objectively cruel monsters, and there's a pettiness to them as well. Sometimes they just do things randomly, and they just do it because they want to have a quick laugh. But they do it with this chaotic sense of whimsy and a chaotic sense of cruelty. As we see with both versions of the Joker, they are casually cruel to the women who trust them. In the Tim Burton film, Joker manipulates, has affairs, and casually murders women when he's done with them. On the other hand, in the 90s cartoon, the acts of cruelty that Joker inflicts on Harley Quinn shows us immediately this guy is a monster. He's so cruel to Harley in ways that are kind of surprising that they got away with in the kids show, I'm not gonna lie.
My fault. I didn't get the joke.
That casual cruelty is part of what makes Joker interesting. He's disorganized. He doesn't always make sense. And while he has plans and plots, they always seem short-term and petty.
I knew your massive ego would never allow anyone else the honor of killing me. Though I have to admit she came a lot closer than you ever did.
In the animated series, for example, he stalks a guy all his life because he cut him off in traffic. That kind of random cruelty is interesting and dynamic. Whereas in the Nolan films, Joker is he's an agent of chaos. He is a man with a moral philosophy. He is here to push his agenda and show Batman while his world is wrong, or maybe while show Batman things about himself he didn't seem to know before. That's interesting. That interpersonal conflict is great. But he's also really funny. And while everything seems random and seems chaotic, there's actually a deeper idea behind it. It's a different take on the character that was interesting at the time, and still is interesting and compelling. The problem is not that Nolan's Joker is a bad character. The problem is that people tried to make Nolan's Joker the main version of Joker and missed how good it was. You know, they missed the mark every single time. But they tried chasing dogs and didn't know what to do with them when they caught them, you know? Shortly after Dark Knight came out, Brian Azzarello's Joker graphic novel came out. This comic depicts Joker at his most violent, most cruel, most sadistic, in a way that kind of diminishes the character, I think. There's too much reason now. There's too much violence. The shock of the Joker is no longer he's going to do these crazy, zany things for fun. It's that he's a cruel monster and will hurt you and is sadistic and just evil. He becomes a horror movie villain. And I think that lessens the character. The Joker is someone who has done insanely cruel things in the past. The Killing Joke, A Death in the Family, even The Dark Knight Returns, all depict Joker as horrifying. But the horror always feels like it fits the joke, like that makes sense. Only Joker that comes really close to The Dark Knight is the Killing Joke Joker, where he has this idea, this plan. He wants to prove that anyone given one bad day can snap. Outside of that, things are just random. Like Death in the Family does end with the Joker killing Jason Todd with a crowbar, but it also involves him becoming an ambassador to like the Middle East too. So like what's going on with it? It's random, it seems. And it seems that in that chaotic randomness, an act of cruelty of a great nature happened. The problem is now Joker has to have these great plans. He has to be this big philosophical thinker, as opposed to having these short-term plans to cruelly hurt Batman. He now has this moral philosophy that he has to enact. He is still an agent of chaos, but as we see in the various movies, he becomes different. And if not superficially, then thematically. The death of the family is a great Joker storyline. Yes, it was one of the best parts of the New 52. But I think what ends up happening is it set a precedent that every Joker story had to be the Joker story. It had to be the next Dark Knight. It had to set the stage for something big with the character. And you can't do that objectively. You can't hit a home run every single time. But to become the next big storyline, it took iconography from The Dark Knight. Oh, Joker's scarred in that. Well, now he has a face that's been cut off, so he looks even more visually disturbing. Oh, Joker, you know, he has this desire to complete Batman. And yes, that's in the comics too. But now it's like his only drive. It's no longer just fun for the sake of fun or his own sick idea of fun. It's that he has to prove a point to Batman every single time. Every story has to be the big idea. He can't just do like an Emperor Joker storyline where he takes over the world and makes everything a big practical joke to reflect his insanity. Even looking at, say, the Injustice storyline, what's the joke in that? That he just did a cruel thing to Superman and made Superman break his moral code. That's the psychological game of it, yes, but there was little humor in it. There's no funniness in it. There's no, like, yes, it is cruel. Yes, Joker has been cruel in the past, undeniably so. But this problem became that cruelty was the only point. When Joker always had a sense of irony with his cruelty. He was vile and vicious, but there had to be something funny about it. In Justice, it's not so much funny. It's just cruel. And it makes for a good story, a good linchpin to a story, but it's not interesting from a Joker perspective. Any villain could have been the one to drive Superman to do that. It happened to be Joker because it's a big name villain. Joker in Injustice serves the same role that Mysterio plays in Old Man Logan. He's just a villain selected because he's popular to enact this hallucination that drives the hero to destroy that which he loves. If Scarecrow did this, there would be no difference. The Joker has to be unique. The Joker is someone who can only do what the Joker does. If the Joker does something that any other villain could do, manipulate a hero to destroy his own people and just destroy it, then there's almost no point. There has to be some cruel, sick, ironic twist to it all. Some humor, some joke. But there's no punchline here, just tragedy. Joker is tough to write because you have to balance the clown out with the vile monster. And The Dark Knight got that balance, but say Jared Leto did not. Jared Leto's Joker is awful. It's all of the edginess of the Dark Knight Joker with none of the humor. He pretends to have this moral philosophy, but really it's just bullshit. It's all bullshit. His character has nothing to him. He just does things and it's like, oh, I want to get Harley back. I want to get Harley, whatever. And then he dumps her right after. There's no sense of that cruelty you got in the DC animated version or anything like that. Even the ideas of the Arkham Asylum Joker, there is a cruelty there to it. There is a sense of humor, and it draws heavily from the Grant Morrison story of Arkham Asylum, where Batman has to go through Arkham Asylum and be his biggest villains, and ultimately that story ends with the idea that Joker molds his personality to the occasion that comes around. The problem is Joker has only been molded now as this sadistic monster every single time, with no hint of jokes. Just, what can I do to be the most destructive, most awful thing in the world? There's no story where, like, say, Joker makes all the fishes smile. You know, there's no storyline where Joker just enacts petty revenge against a guy for some petty fault. It has to be this gigantic, huge thing or nothing at all. There's no casual Joker story anymore. Come Joker the movie, and that becomes even worse. We try to justify and understand Joker so much in that film that it becomes a deconstruction of what we want in a Joker story. There are no elements of Alfred Fleck that resembles the Joker, other than that he laughs and has face paint on. But there's no planning, there's no intelligence. He's just a dope, and it becomes even more apparent when Joker 2 comes around and shows what people who didn't like the first Joker were already saying, that he's not the Joker. He doesn't feel like the Joker. And now the whole movie is about not being the Joker, that the public image escapes the character. And that's not interesting because we already said that for the first film. It's just an underwhelming character who was meant to be this kind of like, we live in a society kind of thing. And in fact, that meme, that we live in a society, that's so underwhelming. That's not interesting anymore because the Joker should be someone who paints a parody of society.
This town needs an enema.
If it was just villains that were the problem, though, that's one thing. You can manage that. But one thing that Nolan emphasizes throughout the entire Dark Knight trilogy is Batman's isolation. Batman fights this war alone with only Alfred at his side. He longs for Rachel, his love interest, and wishes that she was there for him. When she dies, Bruce falls into deep depression. He is ultimately allowed to languish alone in his mansion until Catwoman shows up. Now, this is a twofold problem. For one, this is one thing I'll touch upon right now and won't mention later. Nolan has a real problem with writing women. In most of Nolan's films, the female characters rarely have their own initiative or arc on their own. They kind of help drive conflict or drive change in the male character's story. A lot of this has to do with how Nolan's films tend to focus on the single strong man character, and how every single component around that male character serves as a vehicle to push the male character's storyline already. But in the Batman trilogy, it really stands out because Catwoman functions as sort of a parallel to Bruce. Rachel serves as the main motivation for Bruce. Rachel serves as the main motivation for Harvey. Talia is motivated because of what happens to Ra's al Ghul. And Bane, it's very much a sense of these characters aren't really acting on their own, they're acting in response to something a man does. That's a small gripe. I'm not the first person to say that. It's a pretty common critique of the Dark Knight trilogy. But what I really want to focus on is less how Nolan fails to write his women. We'll get to one thing, though, later on. But more on how Batman sinking into a deep depression wouldn't have happened if he had the Bat Family. Something that Nolan refused to adapt because he thought Robin was ridiculous. Batman has not been alone since the early 40s in the comics. He's had his family, Robins, Batgirls, other heroes inspired by Batman. The Bat Family is one of the most interesting elements of Batman's character, and Nolan just chose to not feature them. Like, yeah, Jim Gordon is there, but that's not enough. And even Jim Gordon himself ends up without his family, without support systems, by the time The Dark Knight Rises comes around. Because I think Nolan wanted his male characters to be very isolated. And what's the reason, though? Like, Robin being silly, okay, well, Dick Grayson doesn't have to be silly. He maybe doesn't have to be, like, actually dressed up as Robin, but the character of Dick Grayson is very compelling. And I think Nolan realized that because he included his pseudo-Robin character in The Dark Knight Rises, who just happens to have great detection skills. He's a weird combination of Dick Grayson, Tim Drake, and maybe even Jason Todd a little bit, but ends up fulfilling the role of taking up the mantle of Batman. He takes up the cowl at the end of the film. Well, okay, why couldn't there be a Robin? Why did it have to be this random OC when you could have had an established character whose history with Bruce Wayne is very important? I mean, you put Falcone in there. Why not Dick Grayson? Why not also have Barbara Gordon play a role? Barbara Gordon is in the trilogy. You probably forgot because the movie barely has her in the movie. She's there in the background in The Dark Knight, one of Jim Gordon's kids that Harvey Dent takes hostage. A lot of focus is put on Jim Gordon's son, but Barbara Gordon, who is undeniably a more major character in the comics, yes, Jim Gordon's son is very important too, but again, Barbara Gordon is way more important. Why couldn't the orphan cop kid, why couldn't that just be Barbara Gordon? Why did it have to be some OC? Barbara Gordon was there the whole time with Batman's journey. She could have figured out who Batman is, independent of her father, and been a major character, been the Oracle even. Maybe not even Batgirl, just the Oracle character. That could be something. Except an Oracle-esque role for Lucius Fox in The Dark Knight, maybe Barbara could have taken up that mantle and really furthered that element of the more insidious side of Batman's use of technology. Maybe something for that could have been an interesting angle, but instead we just get Batman alone again. And, what's interesting is in the comics, Tim Drake figures out who Batman is, much like how not Robin in The Dark Knight does. Except, unlike, say, meeting eye contact with Bruce Wayne, knowing, that's Batman, I can tell from his eye contact. Tim Drake, he figures out being a good detective. And again, that's the thing about all these films that bugs me. The detection skills in these movies is terrible. So Barbara Gordon would have been better. And if you're going to take Tim Drake's, how he figured out who Bruce Wayne was and who Batman was, and give it to another character, just put Tim Drake in there. Have him be someone who Batman can rely on. And why make him a cop? It's better when he's an orphan who is raised up to avoid the trauma. When Batman takes someone with a common pain under his wing to try to give them a better future than the one he had. A better present, even.
Robin needed to help bring the men who murdered his family to justice.
So he could turn out like you?
So that he wouldn't.
And that nurturing, that care is a major element of Batman's character. Instead, Batman only shows love to two people, Alfred and Rachel. And the love he has for Rachel is very selfish.
Maybe someday when Gotham no longer needs Batman, we'll see him again.
It's very much hey, Rachel will wait for me. I want to be with Rachel. I'll give up being Batman for Rachel.
She was gonna wait for me, Alfred. Dad doesn't know. He can never know.
And that sense of transactional love, the idea that you expect something in return for that love, even though it is not presented as negative, it doesn't seem like a very healthy love that Bruce Wayne has. And indeed, we see that love hurt him in the end. I'm not against a character having an unhealthy obsession in a story. That's a plus in my book. That's a good thing. If you acknowledge it as unhealthy. If you as the writer know when writing it, this isn't exactly the healthiest type of romance. And that's the thing also with Bruce Wayne's love life. There should be a sense of desperation in there. Because Bruce Wayne is so alone. He is so disconnected. This is something that Batman Returns did that was really good. They showed the unhealthy, toxic way Batman and Catwoman long for each other.
We're the same. Split. Right down the center.
That chemistry is powerful, but it's also dangerous. And it is hurtful. And the film acknowledges that it's hurtful. And that's why it works so well. That's why it's so interesting. Because it's this kind of dangerous dynamic as opposed to a very idealized or romanticized affection. And I think The Dark Knight actually does touch upon this a bit. To The Dark Knight's credit, we do see shades of where Rachel realizes this is not a healthy relationship for her. She's moving away from it. Batman can't move away from it. Alfred realizes that the relationship is so unhealthy that if Bruce Wayne were to know the truth, it might break him.
If you lose your faith in me, please keep your faith in people.
And this component does feed into a very interesting idea that is not really played out all that well in The Dark Knight Rises. It's only used as a way to make Alfred leave Batman and make Batman more isolated as a result. And it's actually funny. Robin was actually done really well in Batman Forever, I thought. I thought Batman Forever did a great job. I mean, the movie itself has some flaws, obviously, but I think the dynamic between Bruce and Dick is really good there. And it illustrates how Dick Grayson can rely on Bruce to become stronger and more self-assured, but at the same time, Bruce also needs Robin. Someone who can support him, someone who can help keep him focused on the right path. They show a really good mutual dynamic that is, I think, a little ruined in Batman and Robin, I will say, because the movie's not that great. But Batman Forever got that dynamic down, I think, pretty well. But then we come to Batman himself, and here's where I think the biggest flaws are. You can change Batman's villains. Every single adaptation is done so far. You can get rid of the Bat family. I don't like it, but you can do that. But if you miss the core of who Batman is as a person, your entire story falls apart. And I think where I personally have issues is that Batman is one of the weakest links of the Nolan Batman trilogy. I think above everything else, Batman is the part that does not hold the films together. Now, Batman Begins does a good job setting up Batman. It establishes why Batman is what he is, establishes his techniques, his growth, his development, how he gets all of his gadgets. But after that movie, Nolan drops the ball on Batman. He becomes just a guy who solves crimes, and not an always developing, always growing character. In fact, in many ways, he degrades. He is so stagnant between films that as the world around him changes, he can't change with it. Beyond that, though, there's another angle to it. You see, a common theory about Batman that has sparked online since the Nolan films really came out is that Batman is this super rich billionaire who goes around and beats up mentally handicapped people and doesn't really want to improve the world. He just wants to beat criminals up, the poor, the desperate. And if you've ever read the comics or watched the Batman animated series, you know that's complete nonsense. Even the Tim Burton world, he does charity events, he does all these fundraisers, he tries to make the world a better place, he's careful about what technologies he funds because of the good of the world and all that. If you get to The Batman, the whole movie is about Bruce going through this angry period of his life and realizing how hope can bring about great change, how empathy and care are stronger weapons than vengeance, and how vengeance can sometimes bring about worse results as you inspire those who are disenfranchised, who are vulnerable to being brainwashed or manipulated by a force like the Riddler. The Christopher Nolan Batman is not that. We never see Christian Bale's Batman ever fundraise a charitable organization. We are told he puts money into the orphanages. Sure, okay. So he only pays money to those who have a common pain as him. Okay. So he's only donating money to those who have a common life experience as himself. Okay, that's one thing, but it's something, but it's one thing. The only charity event we see Bruce Wayne directly fund is Harvey Dent's political campaign, and he's not up for election for a while. So we only see Bruce Wayne donate to other rich people. That says something. Bruce Wayne should be donating the funds and resources for the poor to help improve conditions in Gotham. And while we do see Gotham as a city become more standardized, we're told in The Dark Knight Rises that the poor are still desperate, that after 8 or 9 years of Batman existing, the poor still struggle, the poor are still desperate, that the wealth disparity between the richest and the poorest is an all-time extreme, and Batman chooses to do nothing. He doesn't actually do anything to fix that disparity. Which, I mean, he doesn't have to do that, but Bruce Wayne as a character should be someone who cares about those who are desperate. Instead, Bruce Wayne's only reaction is stopping criminals with intense military-grade weaponry. He wears a battle suit. He doesn't drive a Batmobile like a sleek, long vehicle. He drives a tank throughout the streets of Gotham. He blows up buildings to go around. He spies on people using their own cell phones. He exploits the systems of power to manipulate them. He will go across international borders to catch criminals. But we never see him try to actually improve the lives of those who are poorest. He doesn't create resources on screen. We're told he pays money to orphanages, but we don't really see how that pays out. And even then, the money for the orphanages dries up, and Bruce Wayne doesn't even notice.
Why did you say that your boys' home used to be funded by the Wayne Foundation?
Because the money stopped.
He has no clue that he's lost all of his money. He's just kind of like, oh, clueless, you know, whatever. And that's a problem. Bruce Wayne, even when he's like stepping away from being Batman, should take a really hard look at the city and go, what can I do to financially improve things for people? Because that's what Batman does in every other iteration of the character. And the only iterations of the character where he doesn't do that, like the Batman, it's a character flaw. That's a flaw he has to overcome, that he realizes that he's failed the city in some way, or made things slightly worse for people, and the arc is figuring out how to be better. But the Nolan films doesn't even acknowledge that as an option, and that's a problem. Batman becomes a pure crime fighter. And fighter, heavy on that emphasis. His weaponry is extreme, even by normal Batman standards. Batman usually has batarangs and his cape and all that, but that arsenal becomes less and less used the further into the series you go. Another thing worth noting is that in prior versions of Batman, Batman didn't muscle his way through every problem. In the Burton and Schumacher films, Batman uses his cleverness to win. He often finds solutions that don't involve physical combat, but rather turning the assets and weaponry and positioning of his enemies against them. All of these are more clever ways than just running at Bane and punching him really hard in his face a few times. If Batman were as clever as even the Burton or Schumacher Batman, he would figure out a way to maybe avoid fighting the guy who can outpunch him. In Batman's physical condition in The Dark Knight Rises, he should not be trying to figure out a way to punch Bane really, really hard in the face. He should figure out a way to beat Bane using his brain and strategy. That would be a smart decision, as opposed to running headlong with an army of cops behind him and an army of goons all armed to the teeth with weaponry. The world's greatest detective, the man who has a solution to every problem. His solution to Bane, run right at him and try again to punch him after recovering from a physical ailment. And nothing Batman does actually indicates he's actually stronger than Bane now. He should be doing tactics, playing clever, not directly fighting Bane to outpunch him, but to outmaneuver him in some way that's clever and interesting and dynamic. And I really hate this finale for a lot of reasons. I'm not sure you can tell that. The elements of Batman are de-emphasized as time goes on. The bat signal becomes harder to spot. His ears become so short, it could have just been like a little helmet. It almost feels like Batman's embarrassed to be associated with bats. Even though he's called the Batman, he very rarely dons bat-esque weaponry. He goes on a motorcycle more than his Batmobile. He has gun-like weapons that he fires off as opposed to his batarangs and his stealth. He uses less and less stealth as the film goes on, beyond like certain key moments. At the end of The Dark Knight Rises, he's fist-fighting Bane in wide daylight. He's not using any tactical knowledge. He was trained to be a ninja, and yet he's running at Bane head-on with his fists raised. Like, that's not a ninja, that's like a brawler.
And I'm not gonna let anyone get in my way!
Powerful agents to the uninitiated, but we are initiated.
I'm a failure, after all that hard work.
Like, it's kind of staggering when you think about how little Batman's training ties in with how Batman fights after that first film. Like, what does he do that's so stealthy, and oh, he's riding on a motorcycle, the stealthiest way of traveling. You know, oh, he's in a big tank and it's gonna knock over and flip trucks and everything. That's really stealthy. Like, it's cool, undeniably so, but it demonstrates that he succeeds through power. He doesn't succeed through cleverness or trickery or distraction or deception like the ninja does. Which would make sense if he was trained as a ninja. Oh wait, he is trained as a ninja. That's right. That's kind of important, isn't it?
Oh, you think darkness is your ally?
Use your muscles that you work so hard for! He stopped working out last week. Why did you stop working out? I was sad.
Now, what makes it worse, though, I can go past that. You know, we can go through an extremes militarization with Batman. But you look at how it affected later versions. Batman v Superman's Batman has machine gun turrets on his gigantic tank of a Batmobile as well. How many people does it look like he kills in that vehicle? Like, he is ramming people with his car. He's just firing bullets willy-nilly. When he captures criminals, he brands them. He ends the movie going, I'm not going to brand Lex Luthor at this time. I'll just avoid branding him. And it's like, well, that's great. Okay, are you going to stop branding the common criminals who get murdered in prison? What, you don't know that they get shanked in prison because they sport your brand?
One man decides who lives. How is that justice? A man like that, words don't stop it. You know what stops him? A fist.
Everyone on the street seems to know, but you don't know that? I find it hard to believe. Basically, he's becoming an executioner with that. That's an extension of what was done in Nolan's films. To an extent, the extreme militarization, the extreme focus on punishing crime, or putting criminals in prison, or solving criminals like they're a problem in a math equation, rather than Batman finding a person who is going through conflict and trying to stop crime by either helping them or subduing someone who can't be reasoned out of committing a crime. Jason Todd is a carjacker. Like, he's trying to jack the wheels off of the Batmobile, and Batman takes him in as a son. What's so frustrating about all this too is this. When you get right down to it, the problem with Batman in the Nolan films is he has no empathy. He doesn't care about other people. He sees people as how they can service his fight against crime. The only person he really shows any unconditional love for is Alfred. Most of Batman's relationships are transactional. Further, in the Dark Knight trilogy, you tend to see Batman have a weird relationship with his villains. In the comics and other iterations, Batman's relationship with his villains is often complex, often one of mutual need for the other. They exist as some parallel to him, some foil to him. But here, Batman seems almost emotionally divided from his antagonists in ways where he refuses to empathize or engage with their internal conflicts. And this results in some very strange moments throughout the trilogy.
Criminals aren't complicated, Alfred. We just need to figure out what he's after.
With respect, Master Wayne, perhaps this is a man you don't fully understand either.
In the comics and the animated series, and most versions of Batman, Harvey Dent's transformation into Two-Face is a big deal. Batman tries repeatedly to get Harvey the help he needs to recover, and in some versions he comes very close to helping Harvey pull through.
Good old Bruce. Always there. You never give up on me.
Bruce Wayne is Batman!
That's absurd. I know Bruce Wayne. If he's Batman, I'm the King of England.
In The Dark Knight, Batman's first instinct is either to take a bullet for a child. That's Batman-like, that's good. Or shove Harvey Dent to his death. No rationalization, no ways of trying to stop the gun. He shows more empathy towards the Joker than he does Harvey Dent. For a man who constantly shouts how he doesn't kill, he doesn't use guns, he has one rule he won't break, he seems very eager to break that rule extremely fast. The Tim Burton movies, Batman kills a ton, but he doesn't have the one rule in that version, so it's okay. The Dark Knight trilogy constantly emphasizes how Batman does not kill criminals. Okay, he's not an executioner. Okay. And yet, he allows Ra's al Ghul to drop from a train, knowing it will kill him. Harvey Dent, he just shoves off a building. And Bane, well, Bane gets blown up by Catwoman, sure, but she blows him up using the guns on Batman's motorcycle. So it's like, okay, Batman doesn't use guns, but Catwoman kills Bane with guns, Batman put it on the motorcycle. Like, where's the logic in that? It's so inconsistent. And what drives me nuts is this mechanic, this workaround, has been incorporated into later versions of Batman, most particularly the DC Extended Universe Batman. The more they emphasize that one rule, the more frustrating it gets. It's very telling that only 2 live-action Batman movies feature Batman not kill anyone. And the Adam West one doesn't count because Adam West has that thing with the deatomizing or antimatter, whatever. It's silly, it's goofy. But The Batman is one of the first Batman movies since Batman and Robin to not feature Batman taking a life. Think about that. Even with The Dark Knight Rises, Batman helps kill Talia al Ghul, and one of the lamest deaths of all time, sure. We're worse off for that death scene being so terrible more than Talia is. I guarantee it. We suffered more than she did watching that death scene. But again, this all comes down to it. Batman does not show his criminals any empathy. In the Batman animated series, there are so many instances of Batman just showing genuine empathy towards those he fights. Harley Quinn has a bad day, and Batman tries to help raise her up.
Just stay with me all day.
I know what it's like to try and rebuild a life. I had a bad day too, once.
Clayface, who is, by all accounts, a monstrous-looking entity, he shows incredible passion towards to try to help him recover from his own self-destruction.
Look at them, Hagen. Look at what you used to be. You can play those roles again, Hagen. Let me help you find a cure.
Ace in Justice League, that's genuinely heartbreaking to watch, and he shows such empathy in that situation.
I'm dying very soon.
Yes. I'm sorry.
Could you stay with me?
And in the comics, it's the same thing. Clayface is brought into the Bat family because Batman can see the good in him. He tries to constantly save even the Joker's life from time to time, showing empathy even to his worst enemy. And we see that trust pay off. The Bat family is not simply just a support unit for Batman. It's a group of people who willingly come to Batman's side because Batman has shown them kindness. Batman's greatest strength is not simply he's the world's greatest detective, which, by the way, Nolan does not know how to write a detective story. Batman is handed all the answers in the Nolan movies. Oh, how do we know Scarecrow is dumping fear toxin into the water? We find out because we break into Scarecrow's lair and watch it all happen. Oh, how does Batman know where the Joker is? Oh, he hacked all the phones in Gotham and figured it out with that. Oh, how does Batman figure out how to get back into Gotham City after Bane blows up all the bridges and keeps the military out? Oh, he gets there. He figured it out. He's there now. No need to struggle. He's just there. Figured it out.
Impossible.
And with each of these impossible ways of solving crime, Batman becomes far less impressive. We don't really see him investigate in a way that's meaningful. We see him take, the marked bills to figure out where the crime families are. We figured out it's over in... Batman figures everything out because he just knows everything. We don't see him do the legwork. We don't see him detect. Batman has answers because he's Batman. This is unlike, say, The Batman, where we see Batman work every single crime scene. He goes down and looks at the small evidence, looks for clues. We see him work out a solution in his head, and sometimes he works it out too late. Even in the Tim Burton movies, yes, the Tim Burton Batman movies, Batman exercises more detective legwork uncovering Joker's toxic attack on Gotham than the Christopher Nolan Batman does. He buys all the products that he thinks might be contaminated. He tries to figure out which ones are poisoned, and then figures out, they're all poisoned, but they only poison you if you interact this chemical with this one and that and this, and he figures out the solution through that means. We see, yes, most of it is off screen, but we at least know Batman is working through it. We see how he figures it out. That's something that we don't see in the Nolan Batman films. We see him use his intense technology to find ballistics off a bullet, whatever, and that's all well and good, but that's not really enough. Batman in the Nolan films is more about how he stops crime using incredible technology. But it's not really a detective story at that point. It's a crime-fighting story. It's a crime thriller. And I think that cheapens Batman a lot because people don't realize he's the world's greatest detective. He is not shown being a detective. But again, we're starting to see that change. The Batman exercises some of the best detective storytelling we've seen in a live-action Batman film. We see Batman be a detective. We see Batman realize that his violent actions don't make Gotham better, but instead, being kind and empathetic makes Gotham better. In many ways, The Batman is a response to the culture that sprung up after the Christopher Nolan Batman films, and especially the culture that sprung up in the DC Extended Universe version of Batman, a figure who is violence first, detection later. When Christopher Nolan made Batman, he didn't make Bruce Wayne, he didn't make Batman. He made James Bond. He made James Bond in a black suit. It has all the traits of a James Bond story, ultimately. The super spies, the big giant stakes. But you wouldn't see Batman in his world fight a small criminal over a couple of individual isolated murders like he does in The Batman. You wouldn't see him investigating someone like the Penguin, because that's too small. And Batman only works on big things. I think the Nolan Batman films made people think Batman's a cool spy and not a great detective. And that, I think, is the worst component. He's a man who works alone, whose relationships are flashy and extravagant, but they don't really mean much. We don't see in the Nolan films a relationship as intimate between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson. And that's not a romance. No, obviously not, but it's a mentorship. But it's an earnest one. It's one where both parties want to see the other one improve. Where Dick Grayson wants to pull Bruce Wayne out of the darkness that he's found himself in, and where Bruce Wayne wants to make sure Dick Grayson never has to go through a day as depressed and sad and morose as him. Where his life can be made better by Bruce's influence. Genuinely better. And when they argue, they butt heads, they break apart, but they also come together where it matters. And that's the kind of heart that we're missing from Nolan's films. They're very cold movies, aren't they? Like, Jim Gordon loves his family, but we don't see them interact. We just see them like him fake his death, not tell his wife, come back home, get slapped, his kids get taken hostage. They're pawns to further the story, but they're not really people that we get to know. We're kind of kept at arm's length from Nolan's stories a lot of the time. And where stories where it's more of a puzzle, that works. But with movies like, say, Interstellar, which is more emotionally driven, I find that movie fails because I don't get invested in the story. I see something sad, but I don't feel sad watching it. Nolan's Batman films are the same way. When you're seeing something technically happening, it's interesting. But there's not the emotional warmth you get from those movies that you get even from Tim Burton's more romanticized Batman. And yeah, those films are goofy and they are silly and they're not technically as good as the Nolan films. But there's an emotion there that draws me back every time. And of course, The Batman is incredible. A great mix of both technical storytelling and emotional warmth that gets you invested every time. But Christopher Nolan's Batman ruined our modern perspectives of Batman because it convinced a whole generation of people that Batman is a cold, dark figure who is aggressive, who has to fight and doesn't think things through, who doesn't have anyone in his life, who's alone all the time, and doesn't have a whole family of people who he's helped improve their lives. It's a sad Batman that we're being painted into, and I think it's because we think that's more interesting, that the lone man who has to suffer alone is somehow more interesting than a man who is lonely, who, through the comfort of friends, is able to grow and become a stronger, better person. We don't want Batman to heal. And that's the saddest part of the character, I think. We want sometimes our dark, brooding noir heroes to be dark, brooding, and miserable. We don't want to see them get better. I hope that changes. I hope with these new Batman movies, we see a side of Batman that is recovering from his pain. Because I think that's the most important components of Batman. Because as he recovers from his pain, he's able to show genuine empathy towards those he fights. And the best versions of Batman understand that Batman is both the world's greatest detective and a man who knows how it feels to have a really bad day and needs someone to pull you out of it.
Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed up like Batman?
Because he is Batman, you moron.
Was.